hide further walls and selectively rewards development of convenient half-truths. Just look at the strange juxtapositions of morality around you.
I mean, even back in the 90s, the supposed golden age, there was still this discussion happening within the mainstream culture about the potential negative social effects of violent video games. Is censorship necessary? As a consequence of this pressure coming from, the mainstream media of the time, I remember an infamous, hyper-violent driving game called Carmageddon for the PC, which came out in '97, the same year as the original Grand Theft Auto. So there was a lot of controversy in this era of gaming surrounding the depiction of violence, because video games were perceived as being for children, so I remember on the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat, they'd censored the blood, it was turned into sweat. And of course, I think in Germany, the blood in Carmageddon was turned green, the innocent pedestrians turned into zombies. Congress itself were freaked out about FMV, video games specifically, and this is of course full motion video, CDs offering developers the opportunity to use real actors, depict real people in video game scenarios. And of course on the Sega Saturn, the infamous Night Trap caused a lot of butthurt in the States, especially due to this belief that full motion video depicting real humans somehow makes the violence even more depraved and unacceptable, completely ignoring the fact that horror movies, the most degenerate, depraved, antisocial, quote-unquote, entertainment coming out of Hollywood, well, that's fine. To the point where movie violence, Hollywood violence is normalized after decades of this incremental dismantling of the obscenity laws within the US legacy legal system, leading to an increasingly pornographized entertainment culture. And I'd recommend Devin Stack, Black Pill's video on this exact topic. It's really informative, really interesting. But a stupid Sega Saturn schlocky, completely ridiculous horror game with no real blood or anything. There's some peril, women are in peril, right? Wow, that's beyond the pale. So you know what they did? They created the ESRB, the organization that controls how video games are rated, the age restrictions, and of course, the implementation of censorship. And the fact is, gamers have good reason to be anti-censorship. We have been one of the most harassed, persecuted groups in the modern era. You could take the entire Gamergate affair as an example of this astroturfed call, where the moral outrage itself was insincere. It was just an Ilinskian gambit, a tool of political and social terrorism. That's what it was. A manufactured excuse to impose censorship on the community, to push out the orthodox gamer, the straight white male gamer himself, targeted for expressly political reasons under the guise of protecting women and gays and POC, protecting these sensitive groups from the hateful gaming culture. The entire industry and community was remade in the image of far-left, insane activists who, while claiming the moral high ground far above the chuds, themselves subscribe to a kind of inverted morality that makes no sense unless you understand that because these are seething, politically and spiritually Judaized revolutionaries, they are an inversion of the thing that they hate the most, Western morality, itself implicitly Christian in a way that, communists, Marxists, and their progenitors not only hate, but kind of define their entire political and spiritual identity against. As I've mentioned many times before, this is Frankfurt School, subversive anti-Western ideology developed specifically to dismantle the moral foundations of the West. You can't create a completely new system and paradigm and culture and history and shared mythology without the utter annihilation of all that came before, including systems of morality and tradition rooted in thousands of years of history. permeating the very culture itself, the very psychology of the people of Europe, of Russia, of whoever. All must be liquidated in one way or another for the coming revolution and utopia, which is always just one more Christian genocide away. This is the ideology and the worldview of our would-be censors, the people who covet the power to censor the most, even if they won't directly admit it. Everything they touch just turns to shit. And we've seen that, in post-Gamergate pop culture, right? Every single movie that's supposed to be a huge new franchise starting blockbuster, every new video game IP fails. It's all just miserable, woke, disgusting, subversive slop with no soul whatsoever. Hence, a failure to really capture the imagination of the general public. Meanwhile, during this same period, there's a lot of counterculture being produced. There is a persistent contrarian presence online. A kind of agitation coming from not only the informally organized and fast evolving far-right and its various feuding factions, but the meme-verse, the frog posters, the 4chaners, the shit posters, a decentralized immune system reaction happening online, constantly offering a counterbalance to what would be just a totalitarian monoculture of wokeism. And I think that's what they were going for, but the censorship just wasn't enough. They tried pretty damn hard after, Trump winning in 2016 and suddenly all social media being purged of all edge. It completely changed the internet, but it still wasn't enough for this completely fake, manufactured status quo to truly take hold in a permanent way. This mischievous pan-like spirit of the true internet, irrepressible in its ability to still, even after these draconian measures of censorship, influence the mainstream culture. Because everyone knew, hey, this is all fake and gay, right? We all know this. We've killed a lot of our grassroots subcultures and communities that arose out of genuine, interest and excitement and passion and joy. We've killed those and replaced them with this insincere, Frankenstein, homunculus, doppelganger of a healthy entertainment industry culture, but it's just so fake and it's so poorly constructed, and that the true hatred really felt by the creators is bleeding through so hard it all just becomes very uncanny. But their big problem is more and more people are beginning to understand this dynamic for what it truly is. And, the level of censorship that we're at right now is simply insufficient for the required task, which is basically a complete and total lockdown of the internet, a permanent removal of anonymity, absolute censorship of all non-regime approved speech, all content, all art to be scrutinized by an unelected body of regime commissars, so we can get back to producing and consuming as a society nothing but this prescribed, deliberate poison culture, this anti-European, pre-genocidal propaganda that does nothing but harm the consumer psychically, spiritually. And I mention European, right? Because for the Western European white man, specifically, everything the system produces, it's kind of tailor-made to cause him as much discomfort, demoralization, and revulsion as possible, A certain bespoke ethnic sadism. It's worse than living in a completely immoral society, That was kind of like the 90s, pretty immoral, right? Now we live in a period where the moral framework of the society has been hijacked and deliberately altered to cause the average white dude, who's completely innocent, I might add, the maximum amount of soft suffering possible. This is the stated moral position of the regime, and it has been so, at least intellectually, since the end of World War II. And really, for the last decade plus, it's been playing so poorly that they are having to pivot strategically, at least in the short term, as part of this supposed new pro-white renaissance within the ad marketing industry, offering up, the Sydney Sweeney Booba jean commercial as a kind of cultural hedge, as these powerful entertainment industry Zionists begin to recognize the woke movement for the golem that it is. Where once the far left was subtly propped up by a lot of media Zionists, now, in focusing on attacking Israel and Zionism as an expression of, whiteness in the Middle East, a white ethno-state, a colonial state, a genocidal state, on paper, hilariously. And to the uninitiated, Israel fits the criteria for like a modern quote-unquote Nazi regime, and the far left are perceiving them as such. This peculiar and chaotic situation is the reason why I believe we're seeing so much coordinated, faux, morally motivated censorship. We need to protect children. It's like that's the excuse they're going to go with. As this anti-establishment sentiment reaches fever pitch, now that we're seeing various narratives and modes of censorship begin to lose their coherence in real time, again with Elon Musk's X, even though it is a bit of a shit show, there is this renewed sentiment and demand for more avenues of free speech. People feel more empowered to just speak their mind. And this is unsurprisingly a huge problem for our unelected status quo, the cultural and political elites of our time, despite the latest Sydney Booba pivot, reference directly and proudly overtly anti-white Marxist texts like The Authoritarian Personality, written in 1950 by Theodore Adorno, which pathologizes the Western European child as being inherently fascist. And the proposed treatment? Oh, of course, exposure to pornography in childhood. Right? That is apparently the clinical solution to the problem of the authoritarian personality. How are Jews ever going to feel safe in Europe when every single blonde-haired European child could be the next Uncle A, This is like the founding faith of liberalism. This is boomer truth in its primordial form, the concept of never again by all means necessary to reshape the world so that it might be mended, mended without nationalities, borders, boundaries, history, empire, tradition, legacy, race, gender. All of these distinctions could potentially lead to another great man in Europe rising. That's the fear. The Sonic-like figure, the one individual with the right will and personal charisma and power and speed to finally stop Robotnik once and for all. He convinced the animals of Mobius that he was on our side. He convinced us that robots had always lived in the Green Hill Zone. He convinced us that the inflation of the value of rings was somehow sound economic policy. And now he's trying to convince us that in the best interests of our children and to keep them safe, a completely new draconian paradigm of global censorship must be imposed online. And it's very conspicuous watching not only massive payment processors all kind of converging upon platforms like Steam, itch.io, and some others, imposing this type of censorship under the pretext of protecting children from explicit material. At the same time, the UK government is using the same excuse for imposing some kind of new online layer of cuckoldry to the British public. Under the guise of protecting children, they're going to impose this porno scan thing, where you have to scan your face if you want to goon, and that, of course, sets the standard for scanning your face for doing anything. I'm going to have to scan my face if I want to continue with my Stellar Blade Coomer playthrough. I've almost started New Game Plus, as a matter of fact. It's in jeopardy now. And, for the record, I'm anti-porn. I don't like pornography. I think it's devoid of cultural or artistic value. All it is just another industry set up for the express purpose of undermining Western cohesion, society, health, happiness, gender relations, fertility rate. It's all a giant subversive weapon at the end of the day. But the definition is, I guess, the thing a lot of people are fighting over, you know? For the hardcore Redditor leftoid furry coomers who are outraged that any porn would be banned or controlled, you know? I mean, they're similar to libertarians, right? They're just like, yeah, this is an issue of artistic expression, you know? I guess I used to feel like that, but these days, call me an authoritarian, but I believe that some books deserve to be burned for the benefit of an actually serious community and society that cares about its kids, that cares about its people. That doesn't exist, you know, that's fiction. And it's important to note that, you know, the Western regimes aren't banning porn, but they may be attempting to leverage the porn addiction of the male population here. You know, it's that you can have your porn if you let us scan you, tag you, track you, you know. We live in the Coomer materialist porno society. So, you know, if you took away the porn, I think it would be like the mouse utopia imploding immediately, right? Too much of Clown World's foundations rely on a constant supply of extreme pornography. The elephant in the room, this kind of soma that all must consume to prevent the illusion of the entire 20th century just shattering under its own fucking preposterousness, you know? This vast, matrix-like human battery field of goomers producing this psychic magatsuhi of gooner energy that's then feasted upon by various astral, trans-dimensional entities and Jews. You know, this is the same system that apparently is concerned about children, you know? I mean, fuck you. Because really, ask yourself, what is the role of pornographic material in modern society? What purpose does it serve? And if these perverted Asian erotic Steam games need to go, well then, what about the rest of the pornographized culture in our society? What about OnlyFans? Look at the kind of ideas, the type of values and morality being foisted upon the youth of our modern society. You know, it's antisocial on a level that violent video games couldn't even begin to approach. Far more depraved than any kind of otaku bait visual novel. Far more socially destructive than any kind of right-wing or dissident political perspective shared on a random fucking comment section anonymously somewhere on the internet. You know, well, that has to be shut down. No debate, no discussion. You know, the regime is going to abandon social justice as a cause for censorship, and they're just going to go with the tried and true. Won't you think of the children? Won't you think of the children that you're incapable of having because every single woman is an OnlyFans whore and it's impossible to buy a house, and pornography is art and art has become pornography, and you live in an upside-down panopticon painted with rainbow flag flare, constantly whipped by a Chabad Lubavitch rabbi in a clown suit, screaming at you, you're a Nazi, pausing inexplicably to show you a picture of Sydney Sweeney's bust before the whipping continues.